Great.
Okay, our speaker this evening is Whitney Tsai Nakashima. She's a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at the Natural History Museum at Los Angeles County in California. Her research integrates historical museum specimens with modern genomics to study evolutionary and adaptive processes in birds. She received her bachelor's degree from Occidental College,
Hey,
and
Jill, thanks for calling.
she's worked as a lab manager at the Moore Laboratory of Zoology Bird and Mammal Collection, and then she received her PhD from UCLA. The title tonight is Color and Visual System Evolution in Birds. Um, I think you've all read the description of the program. I'm going to turn it right over to Whitney because she's going to be giving us the whole information about this. So, Whitney, all yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Donna. And thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of your seminar series. It sounds like you have a lot of fun events coming up, and I'm happy to be a part of them. I'm also excited to share with you all about some of my dissertation work on color and visual system evolution in birds. So as you probably saw from my background image and also now here on the screen, I don't think I need to tell all of you about how incredibly colorful birds are, but I really just love seeing them here in this avian rainbow. It really shows how colorful birds are, that they really kind of have all of the colors of the rainbows. And it's really just nice to see them displayed like this. And before I really dive into kind of bird coloration specifically, I like to just give a little primer on color, just a really oversimplified version of color. And so, what we call color is really just visible light. It's the reflection of visible light. And visible light is made up of all of the colors of the color spectrum or all of the colors of the rainbow. Um, and, oh, sorry. We really can't see all of those colors with our bare eye. As light is traveling through the air, it's invisible to us. But when we look at something like a prism, it allows us to visualize each of those colors individually. So when light from some source, like the sun or a light bulb, hits something like a prism, it bends and makes the light travel in different wavelengths because colors are actually traveling in different wavelengths. So as you can see here, red light travels at very slow wavelengths, while violet light travels at faster wavelengths, as you can see by the distance between those peaks. And when we see color, what we're really seeing are just wavelengths of light that are being reflected off the surface of an object. And so take this red ball, for example, it absorbs all wavelengths of light except for red. And so what we see is just the red wavelength of light being reflected off of that surface. And in a similar way, an orange ball would do something similar. A yellow ball, again, absorbs all those wavelengths except yellow, and we see the reflection of yellow. But black and white are slightly different. So black actually absorbs all wavelengths of light, and white reflects all wavelengths of light. And so color, as we see it, is really just the product of light being differentially reflected and absorbed by surfaces of objects. And so going back to birds, all of the really diverse colors that birds produce has fascinated biologists for a really long time, well over a century. And because of this fascination, we really know quite a lot about how birds produce color and what colors they produce. And I will mention that birds also have very colorful eyes, they have very colorful skin and legs, and even eggs. But today I'll specifically be focusing on the colors that they produce in their feathers. And so there are two main ways that birds make colors. One of those ways is through pigments. They can deposit pigments into their developing feathers. And pigments are just chemical compounds that kind of selectively absorb and reflect certain wavelengths of light. So think about paints. Paints are the colors that they are because of the pigments that we put into them. And so in a similar way, birds can put pigments into their feathers to create different colors. And one of the main classes of pigments in birds are melanin pigments. And these pigments are the same pigments that are found in our hair, in our skin, in the fur of many different animals like dogs and cats. And birds use melanin pigments to make the colors brown, black, and gray. And melanin can actually be synthesized by the birds themselves. Melanin is pretty ubiquitous. Most birds can create melanin, and it's also responsible for the striking patterns that we see in quails and pheasants. Melanin pigments are also really important for their structural integrity. Melanin is a really robust compound. And you may notice that on birds like seabirds, a lot of them, sea and shorebirds tend to be pretty white oftentimes, but you'll notice that a lot of them have these dark wingtips. And this melanin that's deposited in those wingtips actually helps protect the feathers from abrasion and wearing in these really heavily used feathers. It's also been shown that melanin can be helpful in functioning as parasite resistance, especially in against things like feather lice, which feed on feathers. The other main class of pigments in birds are carotenoid pigments, and carotenoids are responsible for yellow, orange, and red in birds. And birds can't actually synthesize carotenoids on their own. They actually have to get it from their diet. So they have to eat plants or plant products or insects that contain carotenoids in order to deposit those into their feathers. And there are a few studies that have shown that in house finches, carotenoid pigments are actually honest indicators of health. So the redder the house finch, the more carotenoids they've eaten in their diet, and they're showing that they have higher fitness and they are able to acquire these carotenoids in their diet at a high enough level to deposit those into their feathers. And cetacophulvin is a really unique pigment. While most other birds use carotenoids to make red, yellow, and orange, parrots actually use cetacophulvin. So this pigment is only found in parrots, and studies have shown that they can acquire carotenoids in their body from their diet, but they use this unique pigment, cetacophulvin, to make reds, yellows, and oranges. Another unique set of pigments are terracin and turacoverdin that are only found in turacos. So terracin produces red in turacos and turacoverdin produces green. And turacoverdin is actually the only green pigment that we know in birds. Every other green is made in a different way, which I'll talk about later. One interesting thing about these two pigments is that they are both copper-based, and we know that turacos live across Central Africa, which is one of the world's kind of richest copper belts, and so they probably obtain a lot of copper into their diet or with their diet, and it can be really damaging if birds accumulate a lot of copper in their bodies. And so, one hypothesis about why they kind of evolved these colors is to as a way to detoxify the high levels of copper that they are getting from their diet. So that was just an overview of some of the main classes and some interesting pigments. The other way that birds make color is through feather structure. And so, if we think about a bubble is, we think about it as being mostly clear, but sometimes we see light being reflected off the surface of that bubble, and we see different colors. We'll see even a whole rainbow reflecting off. And that is how we can think about structural coloration. And so, in birds, structural coloration is the result of varying the composition of pigments and proteins in bird feathers. And in that way, light interacts with the cellular structure of the feather and the underlying pigments to reflect different colors. And so one of these structural colors is blue. To our knowledge, we don't know any blue pigments that are found in bird feathers. And so any blue that we see in birds is actually structural coloration. And so here's just an example of what that microstructure might look like. Here's kind of a cross section of the feather. We see kind of a combination of keratin, spongy layer mixed with keratin and air vacuoles, and a black melanin layer that is reflecting this blue color. Another color that is produced by structural coloration are iridescent colors, so like those in hummingbirds. Here we can see a slightly different organization of the feather microstructure. And for these feathers, we actually see that depending on the viewing angle, that color might look different. So I'm sure we've all seen hummingbirds here. And you'll notice, in LA, we have the Anna's hummingbirds and the Allen's hummingbirds, and those gorgets are so bright when you see them from certain angles. But if you look at them from another angle, they actually look black. And so that's that structural coloration and the varying light being reflected off the surface of those feathers in a unique way. A couple other colors that are produced by structural coloration are a super black. So this is different than kind of your normal melanin black. Super black actually absorbs way more wavelengths of light than does just your standard kind of melanin black. And it kind of is like a velvet black that really absorbs all of these wavelengths of light. There's also a structural white, so this is an even more brilliant white color, and is found in some Lepidothrix manakins and in rock ptarmigans. And lastly, green is another color that is created by structural coloration. It's actually a combination of carotenoid pigment and structural blue. So I always like to give this example of a budgie. We see this green budgie here. The green is produced by that mixture of carotenoid pigment and structural blue. But because budgies have been bred to be all different colors, we also have budgies that are only blue because it's been bred to not be able to kind of synthesize or convert carotenoids from the environment into a pigment into their feathers. And we also have these all yellow budgies that have been bred so that they can't make those structural colors so that they can make blue. And so we know that birds can produce all of these colors. And so what I was really interested in during my PhD, and because I have this history of working in museum collections, I really wanted to know how we can go and analyze color in birds. And so taking an image of a museum specimen, we would kind of crop out all of the parts that are not the feathers. So taking out the bill, the eyes, the background, and all of that. And my question was, how do we go from an image like this to actually characterizing the color diversity, the color that birds are producing? And so to do this, we came up with a software program called Charisma. It's in the R programming language, which is just a computing language that's really common in the biological sciences. And one of the things we kind of noticed as we were analyzing these images is that often, if we look at these small patches, we get these artifacts of brown patches or gray patches because feathers actually are different colors at the base of their feathers versus the tips. So the tips of feathers will be, the colors like blue or black or orange, and the bases of the colors often only end up being white, gray, or black. And so if those feathers are showing through on the specimen, we'll get these artifacts of having, gray or brown patches. And so what we did was came up with a way in our software to kind of smooth out our images so that we could get, the actual colors of the birds without these artifacts of layering. And so we did this for about 30 or so tanagers, and this putting it through our software program, we have this smoothed image that has kind of like standard colors across it, and then we output both the kind of total number of color categories, which is the K up here, which is for this bird, it's 5. So each of the individual colors that's on the bird. So for this tanager, it's black, blue, green, orange, and yellow. And then we can also get the proportion of each color on that bird. And so being able to do this at a pretty quick and easy way over a lot of different tanagers, we're able to model color evolution fairly quickly in this group. And so to just validate that, the colors that were being called from our tanagers were the correct colors, we compared our charisma data set to a data set where an expert in tanager coloration said, okay, each of these tanagers, these are the colors that are on this tanager. And that was just a way to kind of verify that, our color classifications were correct. And so here on this graph, what we see are that the colors are all in the left column. The hits are when our charisma package and our expert both said that the color was present. The misses are when charisma didn't call the color, but the expert did. Our correct rejections are when charisma and the expert both said, okay, this color is not in the image. And then our false alarms were when our charisma classification said a color was present when it wasn't present. And so for this, really what we want to see are high rates of hits and correct rejections, because that will mean that our program was working correctly, and low rates of misses and false alarms. And indeed, that's what we found is that we have almost 100% hits and correct rejections, which was great. And so now that we know that our package was working pretty well, we're able to look at color evolution across a phylogenetic tree of tanagers. So here I'm showing a phylogenetic tree where each of these tips is an individual, or is a different tanager species. And tanagers that are kind of closely related, so like these two tanagers here, are closely related on these trees because their branch lengths are close to each other, whereas this tanager would be more distantly related to each other. And then if we get back to kind of this node here, this is the most recent common ancestor of all of the tanagers in this group. And so, having our charisma calls, we were able to map all of these colors on our tanager tree. And by doing that, we were able to make some inferences like what colors was the most recent common ancestor of these tanagers. And here we see that our tanager, our ancestral tanager, was likely black, brown, blue, green, and yellow. We can also look at how colors have been kind of gained and lost across the tanager tree. And so for brown, we see that we have a few losses of browns here at these different um, lineages, and then a few gains of brown. We can also do this for blue. We see just a couple losses of blue and a gain of blue. Green, we see again a couple losses, a couple gains, and then yellow, we mostly just see losses of yellow across the tree. And white, we only see one addition of white or gain of white in this tanager tree. And so being able to map this across the tree is great. We can also look to see, what's the rate or how fast are these colors evolving in tanagers. And so what we find are that white, brown, and gray, they both gain and lose colors at similar rates, so at equal rates that are indicated by these lines up are gains of colors. Lines down are the losses of colors, and these are the rates. And so we find that white, brown, and yellow have equal rates of gains and losses for these colors, and that brown has a pretty elevated rate of gains and loss or elevated rate of evolution compared to a lot of other colors. And then for green and blue, they actually gain and lose colors at different rates. So blue has gains of blue. It evolves very quickly in terms of gains. And green, actually, there are more losses than gains. And so for this charisma package, we were actually just looking at our human visible colors. But earlier, I was kind of talking about the colors that birds produce and also talking about visible light. And there's actually a lot more to visible light than what's just visible to us. Ultraviolet, infrared, all of these different wavelengths make up light, and birds are actually capable of producing colors that reflect in the ultraviolet spectrum. They can also make colors that reflect infrared, but here for this talk, I'll mostly just be talking about UV. And in addition to being able to produce UV color, they can also see UV color. And so we know that the ability to see UV isn't just limited to birds. Um, in fact, many fish, amphibians, reptiles, and even some mammals have UV vision. And although the vertebrate visual process is really highly conserved, the pathway to UV in birds is different than non-avian vertebrates. And so this points to kind of an independent evolution of UV vision in birds. And so, just to give a brief overview of avian color vision, this is a diagram of an avian eye, and you'll probably notice that it looks pretty similar to our eyes. So, like us, they take light in through our lens, filter it into the back of our eye, which is also known as the retina. And within the retina, there are these two photoreceptor cells. We have cone cells and rod cells. And so rods are important for detecting dim light and function in motion sensing and peripheral vision and night vision, whereas the cone cells are really responsible for detecting bright light and are important for our color vision. And here in this diagram, I've made these cone cells four different colors because in birds, they actually have four different cone cells that are sensitive to different wavelengths of light. And it determines kind of the sensitivity of that each of those cells. And so looking at bird vision, we know that birds have these four different single cone types in their retinas, and the cone types are sensitive to wavelengths that are associated loosely with the colors red, green, blue, and ultraviolet. And when we compare that to our human vision, we only have three single cone types in our eyes, and those are kind of loosely associated with blue, green, and red. And so you can see that this fourth single cone type in birds allows them to expand their vision into the ultraviolet. And so here's a kind of another look at those sensitivities of each of those four single cone types in the eyes of birds. And you'll notice that I did represent them as curves because these cones are sensitive to kind of a small range of wavelengths, but they have a peak sensitivity. And we know that these sensitivity curves aren't static. And in fact, some birds can shift their cone cells into kind of different parts of the spectrum. And for the UV cone specifically, it can vary pretty widely in its pink sensitivity, and it can move kind of inside of the UV range and outside of the UV range. And so, for purposes of this talk, I'll be talking about birds that have a UV cone within the UV range, having a high ultraviolet sensitive visual system or a high UVS. And then birds with a UV cone that's outside of this UV range having a low ultraviolet sensitive vision or a low UVS. And so from prior research, we know that we can actually infer whether a bird has a high UVS visual system or a low UVS visual system from the DNA sequence of the short wavelength sensitive opsin or the SWS1 opsin, which is the opsin that's associated with that UV cone. And so being able to tell, just from the genomic sequence, if a bird has a high UVS or a low UVS visual system is a really cool tool to be able to think about the evolution of both visual system and color in birds. And so, again, thinking about why are birds so colorful, there are kind of a variety of hypotheses for why birds for why color and visual system has evolved in birds. And so, one, we know that plumage coloration can be really important in both sexual and social signaling. Birds use their colors to kind of stand out or show off for communication and to attract mates. And UV color has been shown to play an important role in things like mate choice. And it can be really important for also signaling between conspecifics while excluding maybe some predators. So if we find a correlation between birds that make UV plumage and have a high UVS visual system, then we can hypothesize that the signaling is probably involved in that system. We know that light environment or habitat may also be important in the evolution of color and visual system in birds. Plumage coloration can be really useful for camouflage. Some birds, are really camouflaged to be brown, like this western screech owl, and to hide in with their surroundings that way. Parrots can also really camouflage, and even though parrots are really bright, you might not think that it's used for camouflage, but if anyone has seen parrots fly into a tree and forage in that tree, they really just disappear in that foliage. And so, looking at kind of correlations between the visual system sensitivity and the habitat or light environment of birds will give us a better understanding of why it may have evolved in birds. And so foraging may be another thing driving the evolution of color and visual system. We know that many fruits have a waxy surface that kind of reflects UV. And so birds with kind of a high UVS visual system may be able to find those fruits in complex visual environments, especially if we think about them living in low light or forested habitats. That kind of complex visual environment that has varying light and dim light settings, a UVS visual system might be really helpful. We also know that some rodents leave urine tracks that reflect UV, and so this could also be useful for predators with that have a high UVS visual system. And so lastly, one things that birds kind of must balance with having a high ultraviolet sensitive visual system is the risk of photo damage to the retina. So we know that UV rays can, cause damage to our eyes. And our eyes do a pretty good job of filtering out UV, but we still, can't look directly at the sun, shouldn't be out for too long. Birds, especially long-lived birds like parrots and hawks, that live in very open environments may be particularly at risk for photo damage, and they have to have kind of a way to balance the benefits of having a high UVS visual system and the risk of photo damage. And so, in order to kind of tease apart all of these different hypotheses, we first need to know what the evolutionary history of this visual system sensitivity is across the bird tree of life. And so, by that, I just mean, which bird species have evolved a high UVS visual system, which have evolved a low UVS system. And so, for this study, what I did was compile genomic data for over 400 species of birds, and I was able to map this. Across this phylogeny. So, this is just a different circular view of a phylogeny of birds. And here I'll identify just some of the main groups. So the start of non-passerines is here, and it goes this direction. And so those are, non-passerine birds are those like ducks and pigeons and ostriches, all those fun things. And then here's the start of the passeriformes, which kind of makes up more than half of the diversity of all birds. These are the sub-Aucine passerines. So these are things like flycatchers and pittas and wood creepers. And then we have our songbirds starting here, and that's kind of the remainder of all of our birds, things like warblers, cardinals, tanagers, a lot of the things that we probably see every day. And so on this phylogeny, the tip colors relate to the visual system sensitivity. So the red tip colors are low UVS, and then the blue tip colors are high UVS. And this is inferred across the evolutionary history of birds. And so here in the center, you see this star is kind of the most recent common ancestor of all birds. And we find that it's likely to have a low ultraviolet sensitive visual system. So again, supporting that hypothesis that UV vision evolved independently in birds. And so here I'm just highlighting some of the groups that have evolved high UVS visual system, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about them later. And so just to highlight, some of the non-passerine groups include sand grouse, gulls, trogons, motmots, and parrots. Some of our sub-Austen groups, it just evolved in antbirds, and that was it. And then across our songbirds, we see them in lyrebirds, fairy wrens, vireos, and then this whole group at the end are our kind of subgroup called passerides, which include things like white-eyes, robins, warblers, and tanagers. And this high UVS visual system is pretty ubiquitous throughout that group. So, to go in a little bit more detail about some of the birds and some of our findings, we found that there's a low UVS visual system in birds that are kind of known to be high aerial flyers. So, this includes birds like raptors, hawks, eagles, and falcons, and also in swifts. And so, one kind of issue that I talked about earlier with this UV vision or this high UVS vision is the risk of photo damage from UV hitting the retina. And it's been hypothesized that these high aerial predators like raptors are at a higher risk of photo damage. And so, it does make sense that they have a low UVS visual system. Previous studies have shown that their lenses actually filter a lot of UV, and so they actually have a pretty low UV transmittance to their retina, and so they didn't need to evolve kind of a high UVS visual system. An interesting result that we found were that in hummingbirds, their SWS1 sequence showed that they have a low ultraviolet sensitive visual system. This was interesting for a variety of reasons. One is that we actually know that hummingbirds can distinguish between UV colors. There have been behavioral studies that show that hummingbirds successfully distinguish between UV and non-UV colors. And so there might be a few possible reasons why our prediction here is showing low UVS. And so one is that they're nested in this clade with a lot of low UVS and nocturnal species. And these species, it's also been really hard to kind of get a full SWS1 opsin sequence from that. And so it's possible that they actually lack an SWS1 sequence and that it's kind of gone away because of this evolutionary history that they're in a clade with nocturnal species. Or that it's very highly modified and it's not functioning in that kind of UVS visual system sensitivity. And so, because of this, we kind of hypothesized that they might have a unique pathway to UV vision. And this actually has been seen in another sensory system in hummingbirds. Their sweet sensory system has evolved kind of independently and uniquely in hummingbirds. So, there is kind of this evidence that they are able to evolve these sensory systems very rapidly and very divergently. We found that gulls and skimmers have a high UVS visual system, and this was surprising for us because, again, those aquatic habitats reflect a lot of UV, this would put them a pretty high photo damage. So we know that fish are known to exhibit UV coloration, and so maybe this could help them to find prey. But actually, high UVS is and any other shorebird. Most of our other shorebirds have low UVS visual systems. So we know that, sorry, am I cutting out? I think I had a low. Are we good? Okay. Know that seabirds are able to feed on fish without a high UVS visual system. So it's possible that for the gulls, this UVS visual system might have evolved to adapt to kind of their omnivorous foraging habits and enable them to forage in both terrestrial and coastal areas. But I think more kind of study into gull vision and behavior is needed to think a little bit more about these hypotheses of why this high UVS might have evolved. So lastly, or another kind of result that we found for songbirds, this kind of ubiquitous high ultraviolet sensitivity has evolved in all of many of these species. And it could function in many different ways. You know, many of these passerine birds have very distinct sexual dimorphism, so it could be really important for sexual signaling. Many of them also live in complex forest environments where, you know, light reflects off of UV of plants, and it could help them to forage in these kind of complex visual environments on things that like fruits that have these waxy film that might reflect UV. And then lastly, talking about the parrots, we do see a high UVS visual system in parrots. And I think, you know, this kind of makes sense with thinking about their foraging. They're foraging often in forests, in high in a canopy or over on fruits, and for navigating different environments. But they're also very lived. So, you know, the risk of photo damage is really high because they live so long. So it's possible that these um, parrots have evolved this high UVS visual system with a way to be able to kind of uh, defer this risk of photo damage. Um, and so I mentioned earlier that parrots do have these psittacofulvins that they use to produce red, yellow, and orange. And hypothesize that these psittacofulvins could help them to conserve carotenoids that are free in their body for antioxidant purposes, because we know that carotenoids have a pretty high antioxidant purpose. So this might be one way that parents can balance having both a high UVS visual system and being very long-lived. And so just as an overview of the evolution of visual sensitivity, low UVS was likely the ancestral state in birds, and high UVS has evolved up to 18 times across the entire bird tree of life. And I'm thinking that, you know, as we continue to um, study more genomics and get more genomic sequencing data, we might even see this number of independent evolutions increasing across the tree. We also found only in one system, the Meluris fairy wrens in Australia, where they had both a high UVS and a low UVS visual system in the same genus. So it's very possible that doing more sequencing, you know, more comprehensive sequencing across the avian tree of life, we might even see high UVS visual system evolving more times. And so now we can both characterize color in birds and look at patterns of visual system sensitivity together. And so I have this visual system sensitivity evolution data set all together, and I'm working on collecting the color evolution data set. And again, I'm doing this with museum specimens. But one thing that I didn't talk about, that if you're familiar with this paradise tanager, we know it actually has this bright red rump that didn't come out in the side view of this museum specimen. We also know that they reflect UV. So in this picture, this ultraviolet photography, we see that these light patches here actually reflect UV. And so what I'm currently doing is capturing kind of the full coloration of birds by making 3D visual models of these specimens in both human visual spectrum and also in ultraviolet spectrum, and have them side by side. And so going back here, what we do is actually put the bird on a turntable, rotate it around, and photograph it from three different angles to kind of stitch all of these images together to make these really high resolution visual models. So then, one, we can figure out what colors they're producing, and we can also see the proportion of colors across their body. We can look at the proportion of UV across their body and kind of correlate that with the visual system sensitivity, the types of habitat they live in, their social dynamics to kind of investigate further why birds have evolved such incredible coloration. Um, and so that's continuing work. I'm excited to keep doing that. And with that, I have a lot of people and collaborators to thank. And thank you all for your attention. And I will take any questions if people have them.
I
Whitney,
have a
thank you. That was a really very, very interesting lecture. I enjoyed that quite a lot. I have two questions. One about the Melurus fairy wrens.
Mhm.
Um, how do you explain the fact that that the two different systems evolved in such closely related species?
Yeah, that is a great question. So, the UV, like the high UVS visual system evolved in like the splendid fairy wren, so in these
Hmm.
blue
Hmm.
fairy wrens, and the low UVS is in the I forget the name, but the red fairy wrens. And so, there is a difference in plumage coloration. And so maybe that has to do with why it has evolved so fast. I think we'll have to look a little bit deeper into that system to think about, are they living in different habitats? How has it evolved so fast? And also looking at different systems to see if we see this again. I think also like more specific targeted sequencing with their visual system would be able to tell us a lot. We just haven't done that work yet, but I think it would
Hmm.
be really interesting to keep investigating that
Yeah,
further.
definitely, definitely. And my other question is a very simple, I think, factual one. You said early on when you were talking about the different types of cones that certain cones were loosely associated with certain colors. What does that mean, loosely
Mhm.
associated?
Yeah, I mean, so when we think about color, it's very complex, right? It's very subjective. It's very biased, I think, to our human visible
Or
spectrum. And so colors actually are defined by us. And so those colors aren't necessarily, the colors that birds are seeing, especially because they have this so, for example, if we think about people who are like red-green colorblind, they have time distinguishing between the colors red and green. And if you remember from the slide of the human visible or the human vision versus the bird vision, I guess I could go back and show that. Um, we do see that those cones actually are pretty close to. Let's see.
Mhm. Oops.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't hear you for a second there. Could you say it again?
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so if we look at the human vision,
Hmm.
we see that these peak sensitivities for our three cones, the green and the red peaks are actually really close to overlapping. And
Hmm.
so in people who are red-green colorblind, those peaks are actually even closer to overlapping, which is why it makes it difficult to distinguish between those two colors. And so why I say kind of loosely is because, I might define green one way. You might define green in a different way. And again, the birds, have this completely different visual system than us. And so I think, they define colors in a different way. And, we also have this variation in why we define colors. And so I think that's why I say loosely
Okay.
associated with those colors.
All right.
That was a
Thank
long-winded question too.
you. Thank you.
In
Yeah.
your diagram, you have the blue-green cones for humans being pretty far apart. Does that mean there's less likelihood of blue-green type color blindness?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually don't know about blue-green color blindness, but I would think, yeah, maybe it's a little bit, yeah, they're farther apart. I mean, it also is, yeah, I don't know too much about different kinds of color blindness, but I think
Well, it's a
just having
personal
those,
question. I have trouble distinguishing between the two, which is why I'm asking.
yeah. Maybe. And I mean, I don't know if it's like, that big shift means that there is like a big shift in genes to make that happen, that there's not really might not be a correlation between like how far the sensitivity moves and, the change in the gene that would make that happen.
But when you say that the vision is evolving, is the suggestion that all of the material necessary for the different color vision is already in the DNA and it just has to be activated? Or is there some other mechanism here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, in genomics, that could be one thing, hypothesis about, any kind of change in genes, right? You have the genetic material there. It's just a matter of turning a gene on or off. There are also just like random changes that happen all the time because of, environment or whatever reason. And those random changes could lead to changes in the visual system. And yeah, those changes don't necessarily mean like maybe you have one change and it doesn't do anything, but you have another change that's the same, single nucleotide change, and it could have like a very big chain, like cascading effects or changed in the genes or in the expression of that gene.
Is there any way to distinguish between the benefits of extended color visions when it comes to whether it's for food or for sex or for both?
Um,
Identifying the other females or males?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, it depends on the system, right? So if you have a system like, the tanagers, we have a lot of birds that are very, very colorful. We know that there is sexual dimorphism, in particular in the UV coloration. So in a lot of species, males are, they look very similar to females, but actually, if you look at UV, they are sexually dichromatic. And so having a high UVS visual system seems like it does pertain to kind of sexual dimorphism and sexual selection. And having that high UVS visual system might allow birds to kind of distinguish between high quality mates, or be able to see them better and distinguish them between males and females better, like thinking about like distinguishing them between a mate or not. And it might just be that these things are all kind of evolving together, right? A lot of tanagers also live in forest habitats that are really complex visual environments. There's a lot of, low light, there's, sporadic light, right? With some light hitting the canopy, some light not even hitting the floor, the forest floor at all. And so I think that there's definitely an opportunity for these things to evolve together within these systems.
Now, quick questions. Studying bird color, have you guys found? I'm sure the answer is yes, but discovered things that can help human beings, like something that you've found that wow, this could like help somebody cure something or something, for industry or something like that. I'm just wondering how your studies could be, what you've discovered could be adaptable for other reasons.
That's a great question. I mean, I think thinking about kind of visual, I think more actually in terms of like studying bird coloration, it's actually impacted like things like material science more. So I've worked with people that are studying kind of making different materials, and they've looked at feathers of like hummingbirds and things to try to recreate that color artificially. And so, especially thinking about like super black, people have done that science side, and there's now like a paint that is like considered a super black paint where that like absorbs a lot of wavelengths of light. On the kind of like human health side, I would think that some of this investigation into photo risk of photo damage and thinking about how birds are, coping with photo damage because, they're living in these kind of like high environments, or like especially the long-lived birds like parrots, and thinking about, how carotenoids might function as antioxidants. I think that could definitely have some human applications. I haven't studied that personally, but
Yeah, that was
yeah.
actually my inspiration for the question was, well, I
Yeah.
wonder what it is about the parrots that within their colors that could possibly, help us live longer.
Right? Yeah.
And then I guess my other question is, I know it was sort of answered in your presentation, but what is the reason there's so few purple birds compared to other colors?
That's a great question. I don't know if I can answer that specifically, but I mean, so it is a structural color, and that microstructure, I think we kind of know from previous studies that that microstructure can evolve pretty quickly. It's a very flexible system, and like a very small microstructure change leads to kind of vastly different colors. And so I don't know if it's just because like the speed at which, those structural colors, and purple is a structural color, can evolve, or that purple maybe in some environments it's just like not that beneficial. Like blue maybe has the opportunity to both be able to stand out but also be camouflaged. It might just be that purple is one of those colors that it just like there's not a lot of benefits in having that color. I mean, of course there are some purple birds, and they're beautiful and we love them. But yeah, that's a great question.
I actually have an answer for that, if it's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, the reason, at least I was told, is that purple, for whatever reason, is an incredibly difficult color in nature to replicate. I
Mm,
have no idea why, and maybe nobody does, but the way purple birds actually, or animals in general, make purple, and we know there are far less animals than birds that are purple. There are not many birds, but there's certainly hardly any animals. Birds actually, because of the way the light hits blue in a certain way, will fake out your vision of purple. So when you have a purple bird, more often than not, it's black or blue that's been somehow in combination, fooling your eye into thinking it's purple. I don't know what purpose this causes. I guess it's just the way they do it because purple itself is hard to do. But that's a
mhm.
mystery, obviously.
Yeah. So interesting.
So
I
there
have
you go.
another question. Um, there is at least one bird in Asia and Europe, and that's the bearded vulture that colors itself. It's orange, the whole body is orange, but if you keep it in captivity, it's white.
Mm,
And the color comes from bathing in iron oxide rich mud. And it
mm.
does that, frequently, and it becomes darker and darker the older it gets. Are there more examples of that? And do we know why they behave like that? Because it's very, very strange.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know of other birds like that. I'm guessing maybe some other people here know about birds like that. I will
Well, I
say
know
that,
the snow geese that I just saw the other day, all the ones in the cornfield, and I think it was because of what they were eating, they all had like orange faces. But that could just be like they're just like not clean. They're just
yeah,
like,
because they're
Most
eating it
likely.
all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
they need a
Yeah.
washcloth.
Yeah. One thing about the Tarocco verdant is actually it's a powdered pigment. So if you wash a Tarocco skin, that pigment washes away and those feathers kind of they just turn gray. So I don't know if that's exactly related. I'm not sure exactly how that system works or how they produce that pigment and how it gets on the feathers. But yeah, it is like a powder-based pigment, which is interesting.
Is there any particular reason why so many cedar waxwings have yellow tips of their tails and some are orange? Very few, but some are.
Yeah, super interesting. Maybe diet. I would
I
I would think what
I dismiss diet because I would think if it was diet, there would be a good mix because they're feeding together. But
mm-hmm.
it's they just seem to be few and far between.
Yeah. It could just be one of those random gene changes that kind of persists in the population that for some reason whatever carotenoids they ingest, the change to kind of get them into their feathers produces this orange. Because we do see, we see lots of variation in color in individuals.
All right, one last question for me at least. Do you have a favorite bird color? Is there like one bird that stands out as your favorite if you to give an example of a colorful bird?
Mm, I do love a resplendent quetzal for color, and other reasons. They have these beautiful iridescent feathers, but also, the very long tail. We love it. I also love a Montezuma quail because I think the patterning is also beautiful. This is a very hard question. I like lots of bird colors.
Any other questions for Whitney?
Yes.
Okay, Chris.
I was wondering about penguins and the UV. Are they more like the gulls?
They are, let's see, what was penguin? No, I think it was a low UVS visual system, so not like the gulls.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering whether the soaring birds are more likely to be low UV because of the fact that they are totally exposed as they're flying, and deeper woods ones might be more high UV as far as likelihood. Is there any
Yeah,
grounding to that? Although the goals kind of throw that out a bit, I guess.
they do. Yeah, but I mean the hawks and the swifts, I think definitely, support that hypothesis that um these birds that are, high and soaring and they have this low UVS visual system, and also that they probably filter out a lot of that UV anyways. So yeah.
What are some of the protections that birds have? Because you alluded to protective systems for that high UV
Mhm.
visual system. What are those physical or are those
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
behavioral?
similar to us with like the filtering of the lens. So like our eyes, the lens filters out a lot of UV. I think they found that in hawks for sure that their lens also filters out a lot of UV.
But the hawks are mostly looking down. They're not looking straight ahead.
It's true, yeah.
I mean, whereas the swifts are probably looking up, down, and every which way.
True, yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions?
A question regarding birds of paradise. When they have that many different colors as opposed to a brilliant one or two colors, how does that play as far as do they have or have you found that they have extended UV, or that's just because we see them as that as opposed to them seeing themselves as that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think about what bird of paradise, what their visual system sensitivity is, and I can't think of it quite right now. But I will say like going back to either like tanagers or going back to parrots, all of these different colors. Tanagers, especially birds that are in forested habitats, having a lot of different colors on their body actually could help them camouflage in those forest habitats better just because it's such a complex environment where, light is filtering in at different levels, it's reflecting off of leaves and things like that. And so being in the canopy, those forests might, it might actually be camouflaged, kind of like how the parrots that are bright green are camouflaged, even though they're brightly colored.
Thank you.
All right, I guess that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Whitney, thank you so much. Quick question: how'd you get into this? How'd you end up have your focus on bird color?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just working in a museum collection for a long time, I got to look at all of these different colorful birds. And then when I started my PhD, I had an so I was working at the Moore Laboratory of Zoology, which is at Occidental College. It's a college, small liberal arts college in LA. The Moore Lab is a collection of birds. It's the largest collection of birds from Mexico in the world. And one of our undergraduates at that time kind of made this 3D bird pipeline. And so we were thinking about ways that we could, use those models in thinking about color evolution. And so just kind of putting that all together in my first year of my PhD, I was like, I think this would be a great way, a great project for my PhD. And so it's just kind of evolved from there. I will say I also do a lot of like conservation genomics work. So this was one half of my PhD, and on the other half, I was studying kind of yellow warbler genomics.
I have a quick question, Miss Benny. Um, those birds behind you, like they're just gorgeous. It's just such a basic question. Don't they fade with age? The
That is a
skin?
great question. Yeah. So they can fade with age. For the most part, the things that deteriorate bird specimens is actually just light is the main kind of thing that will make birds fade. So as long as these birds are kept in the dark in cases, they, for the most part, will keep their original colors. There have been kind of studies over time looking at, color fading over time. And so there is a little bit of that maybe we don't have to think too much about now when we're thinking about color evolution, but kind of at a finer scale, if we're thinking about like individual variation, that's
Right.
something we definitely would need to take into consideration, I think.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
Well,
thank you so much for having me. This was a
that
lot
was
of fun.
terrific.
Great
Thank you, Whitney.
questions.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
And one last quick reminder about Sunday.
Yes, we have a 3 p.m. special program. You'll get your Zoom invitation on your weekly announcement Friday for members and Saturday for friends.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Whitney, so much.
Thank you.
So.
Thank you.
Nice to